The fog in Oakhaven didn't just roll in. It crawled, thick and salty, off the Pacific to swallow the streetlights of the downtown district. By 11 p.m., the only glow on the block came from the Gilded Thimble, a narrow, Victorian-era storefront that had been boarded up since the Great Depression. Maya smoothed her apron, the stiff fabric smelling of cedar and something sharper, like ozone. She needed the money, and the owner, a man who sounded like dry leaves over the phone, hadn't even asked for a resume. "Just keep the lights on," he'd said. "Don't open the basement, and don't mind the settling." Locals had crossed the street to avoid the shop as she arrived. An old woman walking a terrier had caught Maya's eye, mouthed the word "no," and hurried away. Maya brushed it off. It was California. Everyone had a theory about ley lines or haunted architecture. Inside, the shop was a masterpiece of mahogany and brass. Spools of silk thread lined the walls like colorful eyes, and the air was heavy with the silence of 50 years. Midnight, the first movement. When the clock on the town square struck 12, the atmosphere shifted. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. Maya was reorganizing a display of silver thimbles when she heard it, a soft scritch-scratch from the storage room behind the counter. It sounded like fingernails on wood. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice felt thin, swallowed by the velvet curtains. The scratching stopped. Then a heavy roll of tweed fabric on the top shelf vibrated. It didn't fall, it just shifted 2 inches to the left, as if a hand had reached out to steady it. Maya's skin prickled. She stepped toward the counter, but the overhead chandelier began to hum. The light flickered, a strobe effect that turned the shop into a series of jagged, disconnected snapshots. Flash! The mannequins in the window were facing the street. Flash! They were turned toward her. Flash! They were 3 feet closer than they had been a second ago. 1 a.m., the watched feeling. The temperature plummeted. Maya could see her breath blooming in the air like ghostly flowers. She tried to reach for the telephone, but the cord had been severed, not cut with scissors, but frayed, as if it had rotted through in a matter of minutes. She felt a gaze so heavy it was almost physical. It wasn't coming from the windows, but from the gaps between the floorboards, the shadows behind the mirrors, and the dark mouth of the storage room. Suddenly, the cash register, a heavy brass monstrosity from 1910, chimed. The drawer flew open with such force it hit the backstop with a violent clang. "I'm leaving," she whispered to the empty air. "I don't care about the pay." She grabbed her coat, but as she turned toward the front door, the locks turned themselves. Click, click, click. The heavy iron bolt slid into place, driven by an invisible hand. The shop was no longer a place of business. It was ajar, and she was the firefly trapped inside. 2 a.m., the paper trail. Desperate to find another exit, Maya retreated behind the counter. She hoped there was a back key in the register. Her hands shook as she sifted through the drawer. There was no modern currency inside, only oxidized copper pennies and silver quarters dated from the 1920s. Tucked underneath the coin tray was a stack of yellowed, brittle paper. It was a ledger of sales, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. The storage room door creaked open. A shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, began to bleed across the floor toward her. It had too many limbs, and they moved with the jerky, unnatural gait of a broken marionette. "I need to know why," she thought, her mind fracturing under the terror. "Why me?" She pulled the top receipt from the stack. The paper was parchment thin, crackling like a dying fire in her grip. It was dated October 14th, 1936. Maya's eyes moved down to the customer name line. Her breath hitched. The ink was elegant, looped, and unmistakably fresh, as if the ink had just been laid down by a phantom pen. Customer, Maya Elise Vance. Item, final fitting. Status, paid in blood. The shadow reached the edge of the counter. Maya looked down at her own hand and screamed. The skin was turning translucent, showing the pale white bone beneath as the shop began to pull her back into the era where she apparently belonged. She wasn't a new hire. She was a missing piece of inventory. The fog was even thicker the second night, a damp shroud that muffled the sounds of Oakhaven until the world felt reduced to the 10-foot radius around the shop's entrance. Maya stood on the sidewalk for a long time, her hand hovering over the brass door handle. Teen told her to run, to pack her bags and drive until the California coast was 1,000 miles behind her. But a strange magnetic lethargy had settled over her. Her memories of the previous night felt like a fever dream, hazy and impossible, yet the bruised skin on her wrist where she had pinched herself remained. She told herself she needed the paycheck. Deep down, she felt a sickening pull, as if the shop had already claimed a portion of her soul, and she was merely coming back to collect the rest. The lock turned with a familiar heavy thud. 11:30 p.m. The resonance. The interior of the Gilded Thimble was silent, but it wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a held breath. Maya stayed behind the counter, the receipt from the night before tucked into her pocket. She kept the lights at full brightness, but the shadows seemed more aggressive tonight. They pooled in the corners like spilled ink, defying the reach of the electric bulbs. Then the sounds began. It started with a rhythmic thump-drag from the floor above. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy bolt of wet wool across the floorboards. Maya froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany counter so hard her knuckles turned white. "I'm just here to work," she whispered, her voice cracking. The dragging stopped. In its place came a sound that made the hair on her neck stand on end. Breathing. It was wet, ragged, and seemed to be coming from the air right beside her ear. She whirled around, swinging her arms, but met only empty, cold air. 12:45 a.m. The invitation. The storage room door, which she had personally bolted and pushed a heavy chair against, didn't just open, it disintegrated. The wood didn't break, it simply ceased to be an obstacle, swinging inward with a slow, agonizing groan that sounded like a human scream stretched thin. Maya backed away, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood. She expected something monstrous to roar out. Instead, there was only a terrifying stillness. Within the darkness of the storage room, a figure emerged. He didn't walk, he was simply there, framed by the doorway. He wore a charcoal-colored suit with high, stiff lapels and a narrow tie, the fashion of a man who had died in the mid-1930s. His skin had the texture of cured leather, and his eyes were not eyes at all, but two flat, matte discs that reflected no light. He stood unnaturally still, more like a statue than a living thing. His arms hung limply at his sides, but his fingers were elongated, tapering into sharp, yellowed points. He didn't move toward her, he didn't even blink. He simply watched, his presence radiating a cold so profound that Maya felt the moisture on her eyes begin to sting. "What do you want?" she gasped, her back hitting the far wall, right beside the shop's centerpiece, a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror with an ornate silver frame. The man in the suit didn't answer. He tilted his head, a sudden, jerky movement that snapped at a 45-degree angle. The sound of his neck vertebrae popping through the shop like gunfire. 2:15 a.m. The resonance. Maya couldn't look away from him, yet she couldn't bear to look at him. She felt her sanity fraying. Every time she blinked, he seemed to have moved an inch closer, though she never saw his feet shift. The shop's lights began to fail, one by one. The bulbs didn't just burn out, they imploded, glass showering the floor like diamonds. The darkness was closing in, leaving only the area around the great silver mirror illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the fog. Maya's breath came in short, jagged gasps. She looked at the figure in the doorway. He was leaning forward now, his shadow stretching across the floorboards until it touched her shoes. The shadow felt heavy, pinning her feet to the ground. Desperate for some sense of reality, Maya's eyes darted to the mirror beside her. The glass was old and wavering, giving the world a watery, distorted look. In the reflection, she saw herself, pale, terrified and trembling. And then she saw him. In the mirror's world, the man wasn't across the room in the doorway. He was standing directly behind her. His long, leather-bound fingers were hovering just millimeters from her throat. She could see the individual threads of his ancient suit, the dust motes dancing in the reflection of his dead eyes. He was so close, she should have felt the heat of his body or the stir of his breath against her hair. The reflection of the man opened his mouth, a bottomless pit of blackness, and began to lean his head toward her. Maya let out a choked sob and whirled around, her hands up to ward him off. The space behind her was empty. There was no man, no shadow, just the dim, dusty floor of the shop and the open, yawning mouth of the storage room across the room. She stood panting, her silence returning with a deafening weight. Slowly, with her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she turned back to the mirror. In the glass, she was still alone, but as she watched, a hand, long, gray, and tipped with yellow nails, slowly reached out from the bottom edge of the mirror's frame, not as a reflection, but as something real, gripping the silver border from the inside and beginning to pull.
The third night began not with a walk, but with a pull. Maya had spent the daylight hours in a sun-drenched park, clutching a coffee cup and trying to convince herself that the shop didn't exist. She had even dialed the owner's number to quit, but the line had only produced the sound of a sewing machine whirring at a frantic, impossible speed. Now she stood before the door of the Gilded Thimble. She didn't want to enter, yet her hand moved with a terrifying autonomy, sliding the key into the lock. The air in Oakhaven was unnaturally still, the fog standing like white marble pillars around the entrance. When she stepped inside, the shop didn't just smell of cedar, it smelled of fresh sweat, hot iron, and something metallic like copper spilled on wood. 11:45 p.m. The great shifting. Maya didn't even try to go behind the counter. She turned to leave, but as she reached for the handle, the shop groaned. It was a deep, structural sound, the scream of wood being bent by time. She watched in paralyzed horror as the layout of the store began to rearrange itself. The modern shelves she had dusted 2 nights ago folded back into the walls. In their place, heavy oak cabinets erupted from the floorboards, filled with items that hadn't been there a moment ago. Glass jars of leeches, bone-handled razors, and rolls of heavy black crepe used for Victorian mourning veils. The walls didn't just shift, they bled history. The peeling wallpaper smoothed itself out into a vibrant, nauseating floral pattern. The electric bulbs flickered and died, replaced by the sudden violent hiss of gas lamps, flare lighting themselves. The shop wasn't just haunted, it was resetting. "Please," Maya whispered, her voice sounding muffled, as if she were speaking through layers of heavy wool. "Let me go." 1 a.m. The shopkeeper's debt. A wet, sliding sound came from the storage room. This time, the figure didn't stay in the shadows. He stepped into the flickering gaslight, and for the first time, Maya saw him clearly. He was a man of sharp angles and graying skin, his eyes sunken into his skull like rotted fruit. He wore a heavy leather apron over his charcoal suit, stained with dark, irregular blotches. He held a pair of long silver shears that glinted with a cruel, polished light. This was Elias Thorne. Maya knew it instinctively, the name blooming in her mind like a poisonous flower. He was the man who had owned this shop 90 years ago, the man who had been found dead behind the counter, his heart stopped, but his eyes wide open. He wasn't attacking her, he was working. He began to pace the floor, his movements rhythmic and obsessive. He measured the air with his shears, cutting through nothingness. He was reliving the final frantic hour of his life, a loop of temporal trauma that had turned the shop into a scar on the face of time. Maya realized then that the shop didn't want to kill her, it wanted her to witness. 2:30 a.m. The invisible crowd. The atmosphere grew heavy, the air thick enough to choke on. The temperature swung wildly from freezing to a stifling, humid heat. Maya huddled against a display of funeral lace, her eyes locked on Elias. Suddenly, the bell above the door chimed. Clang, clink. The door didn't open. The street outside was still a wall of silent gray fog, but the floorboards near the entrance groaned under the weight of several sets of feet. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," a woman's voice chirped, clear, bright, and terrifyingly close to Maya's ear. "It's a bit late for a fitting, isn't it?" a man replied, his laughter sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. Maya's breath hitched. The shop was empty. The gaslight illuminated only the dust motes and the skeletal figure of Elias Thorne. But the air was suddenly alive with the rustle of silk skirts and the heavy thud of work boots. "We've all been waiting, Elias. The girl is here. Is she the one?" Another voice whispered, this one from the empty space directly in front of Maya. Elias stopped his frantic clipping. He turned his dead, matte eyes toward Maya and raised the shears. Around her, the cacophony of the invisible crowd rose to a deafening roar, dozens of voices laughing, bartering, and whispering her name in a frantic, overlapping tide. "I'd like a yard of the red," a demand inches from her face. Maya looked at the door, then at the empty floorboards where the footsteps continued to stomp and dance. She was surrounded by a bustling, invisible ghost town, trapped in a moment of history that refused to die. "Next in line," a booming voice shouted from the void. The shop was empty, but as the invisible crowd pressed in against her, Maya felt the cold, firm pressure of a dozen hands reaching out to guide her toward the counter. The fog outside was no longer weather. It was a wall of white concrete. Maya threw her weight against the front door of the Gilded Thimble, but the glass didn't even rattle. It had become as cold and unyielding as a tombstone. Behind her, the shop had completed its transformation. The modern world was a dead memory. The gas lamps hissed like nesting vipers, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the furniture. 11 p.m. The stitch in time. Maya's fingers were raw from clawing at the wood. She turned, her back to the door, and watched the shop breathe. The floorboards pulsed. The spools of silk on the walls began to unspool on their own, the threads snaking across the ceiling like a web.
"Let me go!" she shrieked, but her voice didn't carry. It was muffled by the heavy, suffocating scent of lilies and old dust. Elias Thorne was no longer a flickering image. He stood behind the counter, his charcoal suit now crisp, his leather apron wet with a dark, glistening substance. The matte discs of his eyes had turned into mirrors, reflecting not the shop, but Maya's own terrified face. "The ledger must be balanced," he said. His voice didn't come from his throat. It vibrated out of the walls, the floor, and the very air she was breathing. 90 years I have held the shears. 90 years I have kept the shop for a master who never sleeps. I am tired, Maya. I am so very tired. 12:30 a.m., the final fitting. Maya bolted for the back storage room, but the geometry of the shop had soured. The hallway stretched into an infinite tunnel of silk and shadow. Every door she opened led back into the main room, facing the counter, facing him. Elias began to walk toward her. Each step he took echoed twice, once in the present and once in 1936. "You were chosen the moment you looked at the sign," Elias whispered. He raised the silver shears. "Your name was written in the wood before your grandmother was born. The shop doesn't want your life, Maya. It wants your time." He lunged with impossible speed. Maya scrambled behind a mannequin, but the wooden figure moved, its articulated wooden fingers snapping shut around her wrists. She screamed as more mannequins tilted forward, their painted faces cracking into jagged grins. They pinned her against the massive silver mirror, their grip like iron vices. Elias stood before her, the shears open. He didn't point them at her heart, he pointed them at her shadow. A swap of souls, a trade of shadows. He began to snip at the air around her silhouette. With every snick of the blades, Maya felt a piece of her warmth vanish. She felt her memories of the sun, of her family, and of the California sky being drained away, replaced by the cold, stagnant logic of the shop. 3 a.m., the handover. The pain was a dull, rhythmic throb. Maya watched in horror as her own skin began to take on the tint of old parchment. Her clothes bled their color until her denim jacket became a stiff, charcoal-colored coat. Elias Thorne leaned in close, his face inches from hers. For the first time, he smiled, showing teeth like yellowed piano keys. "It's your shift now," he whispered. The shop let out a violent, shuddering groan. The gas lamps flared into a blinding white light that consumed everything. Maya felt a sensation of falling, not down, but backwards, through decades of screams and silence. Then the light vanished. The pressure on her wrists disappeared. The shop went silent. 8 a.m., the new opening. The morning sun hit the fog, turning Oakhaven into a bright golden haze. A young man, barely 20, stood in front of the shop. He held a help wanted flyer he'd found tucked under his windshield. He was nervous, but he needed the money. He turned the key. The door, which had been an immovable slab hours before, swung open with a cheerful chime. "Hello?" he called out, stepping onto the polished hardwood. "I'm here about the job." The shop was beautiful, clean, smelling of cedar and fresh silk. The morning light caught the silver thimbles, making them sparkle. Behind the mahogany counter stood a girl. She was wearing a stiff Victorian-style apron over a charcoal dress. Her hair was pinned back with clinical precision. She was perfectly still, so still she looked like a masterpiece of wax and wire. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She simply watched him with eyes that looked like flat, matte discs, reflecting nothing. The young man felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. He looked at her name tag. It read, Maya. "Are you the manager?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Maya didn't answer. She only reached under the counter and placed a fresh, blank receipt on the wood. She handed him a pen and waited. Outside, the door clicked shut and locked itself, and the shadows in the corner began to crawl.